In Plato's Symposium, Socrates recounts the lessons learned from Diotima, the mysterious woman from Mantinea, wise beyond measure. She speaks to him about the nature of love and of beauty, drawing attention to the limits of ordinary perception and the confusions that arise from quick and passionate responses to things. If these limitations are to be overcome, she says, one must be instructed and shaped from the earliest years with habitual exposure to what is beautiful, encouraged to love them. And under these favoring conditions, she says, quote, soon he will of himself perceive that the beauty of one form is akin to the beauty of another. And then, if beauty of form in general is his pursuit, how foolish would he be not to recognize that the beauty in every form is one and the same. And when he perceives this, he will abate his violent love of the one, which he will despise and deem a small thing, and will become a lover of all beautiful forms. In the next stage, he will consider that the beauty of the mind is the more honorable than the beauty of outward form, until he is compelled to contemplate and see the beauty of institutions and laws, and to understand that the beauty of them all is of one family, and that personal beauty is a trifle. And after laws and institutions, he will go on to the sciences, that he may see their beauty. He who has been instructed thus far in the things of love, and who has learned to see the beautiful in due order and succession, when he comes toward the end, will suddenly perceive a nature of wondrous beauty, until from fair notions he arrives at the notion of absolute beauty, and at last knows what the essence of beauty is. This, my dear Socrates, is that life above all others which man should live in the contemplation of beauty absolute. Oh, well, has anything better on the subject ever been written? Well, this is among the first philosophical inquiries into the nature of beauty. It speaks of the essence of beauty as distinct from particular objects, sounds, and events that might be beautiful in the narrower sense. The beauty thus imagined by Diotima does not depend on us or on any percipient for its reality. It is beauty independent of mental representation or personal preferences and tastes. Diotima also emphasizes the conditions under which our access to this is even possible. The importance of early development in the formation of aesthetic sensibilities is clear, as is the need to be saved from regular exposure to what is trite or vulgar. In addressing both what in the object must be present for there to be beauty, and what in the observer is necessary if this is to be experienced, Plato's dialogue virtually establishes the philosophy of aesthetics. The observer, on this account, must cultivate a native, sensuous, and reflective power, which, when properly developed, expresses itself in the form of sound aesthetic judgments. Now, it should be noted that aesthetics has not been understood in quite the same way in different historical epochs. Medieval conceptions were largely a merging of Greek and Hebrew sources, with Plato and the Old Testament enjoying special authority. The art form that dominated medieval aesthetics was music, which was one of the featured subjects of the medieval university curriculum. The quadrivium consisted of arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. The common feature here, of course, being the rational structure of all four. It is Plato's nature of wondrous beauty that is comprehended in the eternal, immutable laws of mathematics, music, and, of course, celestial dynamics. The status of music was highest among these forms of art owing to its mathematical structure, thus grounding it in that very eternal, immutable domain that Platonism reserves to the true form of things. Now, the same reasoning stands behind the medieval conception of beauty as a moral property, and of morals as having an aesthetic quality. And this does help us understand why deviations from strict principles of harmony were regarded as, yes, moral offenses. Of comparable importance in understanding the aesthetic philosophy of the medieval period is the different attitude toward nature itself. Whereas the classical world idealized nature, the medieval Christian world regarded what was earthly, physical, and accessible to the senses as transitory and misleading. Sensual forms of realism were replaced with symbolic and iconic intimations of what was taken to be the ultimate reality behind a world of mere appearances. It is not until the Italian Renaissance that aesthetic theory turns away from such formalism of the object, to the sensibilities of the observer, and, alas, to the concept of taste, which in the Italian is, revealingly, gusto. Now, the term enters into aesthetic discourse as early as the middle of the 15th century. Rainuccini declares gusto to be the same as, quote, right judgment. And in the 16th century, he's saying what taste is, it's right judgment. And in the 16th century, such great figures in art as Michelangelo and Cellini invoke the concept of gusto, of taste, to account for the recognition of beauty in all of its manifestations. Early in the 18th century, essays begin to discuss the measure of good taste, and by 1718, we find nothing less than, quote, an Accademia del Buono Gusto in Palermo. This is a college now for good taste. Whether the Italian buono gusto or the French bon goût, the possession in question is the possession of good taste. It's regarded as instinctive, discerning, judgmental. To possess it is, as the term will be applied later, to be what? It's to be an aesthete. And what are you if you lack it? Well, alas, you are a Philistine. Now, an issue regarded as pivotal during the Enlightenment, especially during the Enlightenment, pertains to the place of rationality itself in aesthetics. Is the aesthetic judgment actually the report of an aesthetic experience, or is it a rational reflection on that experience? Diderot, as might be guessed, regarded it as a faculty shaped by experience and instruction. His fellow encyclopedist, D'Alembert, treats it as a form of reasoning, but others, such as Montesquieu, regard it as a distinct faculty, such that individual works are comprehended within a framework that is aesthetic as such. You know, on this account, you could have sound aesthetic judgment, not particularly good judgment in many, many other areas. In England, a comparable theory would be defended by Shaftesbury, who adds the aesthetic sense to the moral sense as a native feature of the human sentiments. This is something you come into the world with. You might come into the world without it, but when you've got it by nature. Well, as now should be expected, David Hume's philosophy would challenge the proposition that taste somehow finds something in the object that is the source of its beauty. Rather, for Hume, beauty itself refers to the manner in which the senses respond to objects, and how the mental operations will then fashion aesthetic judgments of them. He develops this thesis in a 1757 essay on the standard of taste, where he contrasts matters of fact and matters of opinion. Here's Hume, characteristic Humean passage, quote, "A thousand different sentiments excited by the same object are all right, because no sentiment represents what is really in the object. It only marks a certain conformity or relation between the object and the organs or faculties of the mind. Beauty is not a quality in things themselves. It exists merely in the mind which contemplates them, and each mind perceives a different beauty." Close quote. Now, with Hume, however, this observation does not lead to aesthetic anarchy or the reduction of taste to what is merely uncritical opinion. As in his moral theory, so too in his theory of taste, Hume discovers universal tendencies, universal dispositions and sentiments in the human race at large. So it is no embarrassment to his theory that there will be widespread agreement among persons living thousands of years apart and drawn from radically different climates and cultures, that they are nonetheless moved by Homer or Sophocles. As he says, quote, "Amidst all the variety and caprice of taste, there are certain general principles of approbation or blame, whose influence a careful eye may trace in all operations of the mind. Some particular forms or qualities, from the original structure of the internal fabric, are calculated to please, and others to displease. And if they fail in their effect in any particular instance, it is from some apparent defect or imperfection in the organ. A man in a fever would not insist on his palate as being able to decide concerning flavors, nor would one affected with the jaundice pretend to give a verdict with regard to colors. In each creature there is a sound and a defective state, and the former alone can be supposed to afford us a true standard of taste and sentiment." Well, if then beauty is in the eye of the beholder, Hume requires that the eye be a healthy one, that the mind be cautious and disciplined in observing the features, that the education of the senses be such as to develop requisite powers of discernment. So even in Hume, then, and I say even in Hume, there are standards of taste and degrees of competence that would qualify some as connoisseurs. An account of this kind, however, seems to be challenged by the radically different aesthetic styles that somehow all render experience highly agreeable or right, at least with many whose tastes have neither been neglected nor refined. It's doubtful that the best explanation of such developments can be rendered in terms of sentiment, let alone utility. Now here I want to consider the movement in art and architecture from the Italian High Renaissance of the 16th century to the Baroque style that flourished in the 17th. And if I can pause for a moment to say that the purpose of the comparison is not to make a judgment of better or worse, but here we have Hume saying that there are certain universally distributed ... And now we're going to see architectural aesthetic styles that are so radically different. There doesn't really seem to be that kind of incorporation of universal elements. But let me proceed. The Italian word barocco actually means bizarre, a fantasy or phantasmagoria. And consider further that this very style, this Baroque style, became dominant in certain parts of Europe and rare or even condemned in other parts of Europe. Guesses are invited as to the best predictor of where one will find the Baroque featured. You have 3 seconds to guess where it will be featured. 2, 3. Yes, chiefly in Roman Catholic countries where the Counter-Reformation included a rejection of the spare, ascetic, puritanical aesthetics of the Protestant reformers. In sculpture and architecture, it was Giovanni Bernini, whose dates are 1598 to 1660, who will lead the movement, declaring that the various modes of art should be merged and not divided. The principles that render a statue beautiful are the same as those that will guide painting and architecture. Thus is a building itself, in Bernini's view, a painted sculpture of sorts. Now, concrete expressions of the thesis are the 3 magnificent chapels he created in Rome: the Fonseca Chapel, the Albertoni, the domed church of San Andrea al Chinali. Bernini, of course, is best known for the basilica and colonnades of St. Peter's at the Vatican. In sculpture, perhaps his 2 most popular works are the Fountain of the 4 Rivers in the Piazza Navona and the Ecstasy of St. Teresa in the Church of Santa Maria della Vittoria in Rome. Well, now I find myself dilating on the Baroque to underscore the diffuse influences of the wider culture on how aesthetic forms are received. In mind here is not Hume's sentiment-based theory, but a far more complex perspectival theory in which moral, political, religious thought somehow establish a broad framework within which art is seen, within which music is heard. The Baroque, for all of its influence, was more or less stopped in its tracks by the revolutionary change in perspective in the Enlightenment of the 18th century. You see this radical change now from the Baroque to the Classic Revival. The dominant aesthetic form now does revert to classicism, and a nearly sudden interest in the history of art and architecture, not to mention history at large. Of the many distinct characteristics of the Enlightenment, its identity as the age of history is especially revealing. In this connection, I think first of Winckelmann. Dates are 1717 to 1768. His History of Ancient Art, which appeared in 1764, did much to shape attitudes and to impart knowledge about the classical worlds of Greece and Rome. His depictions of ancient Athens, I do want to pause for a second here. This is a fine book. It's still a very enlightening and entertaining book. But what does Winckelmann do in giving this treatise to us on ancient Athens? Well, when you examine the book, in light of what we now know about ancient Athens, what you see is this. Winckelmann actually has rearranged the architecture of the ancient Athenian world. The rearrangements in this work are by Winckelmann himself. And he's doing this. He intends to give what he took to be a greater coherence and greater effect than would be conveyed by the actual record. Now, Winckelmann actually became Vatican librarian. He became president of antiquities of the Papal States. In his reflections on the painting and sculpture of the Greeks, which appeared in 1765, he declared straight out that, quote, "The only way for us to become great, or even inimitable if possible, is to imitate the Greeks," close quote. No one before Winckelmann had captured the spirit of ancient Greek art and architecture, and few had ever attempted a systematic analysis of it as a means by which to understand the ancient world in its fullness. Look at the buildings of a world and you'll know something about its mind, do you see? His characterization of the ancient Greek aesthetic ideal may still be the most informing and surely the briefest word on the subject. Quote, "Noble simplicity and quiet grandeur," close quote. But if it were not for the contemporary movement of thought toward a secular culture and away from centuries of religious turmoil and their political effects, it is clear that a classic revival would have been received at the aesthetic level of experience? No, I think not. For Winckelmann, this very movement toward secularism and naturalism and away from the transcendentalist character of Christianity might have actually seemed a bad bargain. Winckelmann was a Catholic convert and a man of deep religious conviction. I should say something about the end of his life. His end came at the hands of a murderer who attempted to steal some ancient coins that Winckelmann had with him while staying at an inn. What were Winckelmann's dying words? He included in his dying words the forgiveness of his assailant. Forgive the assailant. Here's an example of noble simplicity and quiet grandeur. Now, in the same year that Hume's essay on taste was published, Edmund Burke had published his philosophical inquiry into the origin of our ideas of the sublime and the beautiful, again appearing in 1757, in which we discover an anticipation, almost full anticipation, of that irrationalism, that Gothic mystery that will pervade the Romantic rebellion. Burke seeks to identify the causes and the sources of the experiences of sublimity as it is aroused by poetry, art, architecture, painting, indeed how it is aroused by religion itself and other spheres of thought and feeling which seem to overcome the senses, overcome the intellect. Now, his thesis is that there are two dominating ideas standing at the very bottom of sublimity: the idea of danger and the idea of power. He writes about it this way, quote, "Sublimity includes, besides the idea of danger, the idea of power also, strength, violence, pain, and terror. are ideas which occupy the mind together. The sublimity of wild animals is due to their power, and the power of princes is not unmixed with terror, so that we address them as what? Dread majesty. It has even been said that fear originated in the idea of deity. And true it is that before Christianity, there was very little said of the love of God." Close quote. The most influential work in the philosophy of aesthetics in the 18th century surely had to be Kant's Third Critique, his Critique of Judgment, published in 1790. Now, though concerned throughout with the grounding of aesthetic judgments, the work is actually a theoretical inquiry into judgment itself, aesthetics being an attempt to illustrate and to test the more fundamental thesis about the nature and the validity of judgments. Now, with respect to aesthetic judgments, Kant identifies 4 characteristics that must be present for the estimation to be at once a judgment and a judgment at the level of aesthetics. The judgment must be disinterested, in that considerations of utility are absent. Well, that's not surprising in Kant. It is the property of the object itself, not its functions or extrinsic value, that is the cause of the pleasure excited in the percipient. Next, aesthetic judgments are offered as universal, not merely personal. When an experience leads to the estimation of its source as being beautiful, the judgment is assumed to be one that would be shared by all comparably positioned and comparably competent persons. Were it not for this feature of aesthetic judgment, there could be no intelligible basis for disagreements and arguments. Third, the judgment presupposes that there is a necessary connection between the relevant properties of the object and the aesthetic pleasure arising from it. That is to say, the connection between the object and the experience of the object is judged to be not contingent, but implicit. And finally, the object of aesthetic judgment is understood as having a purpose, though not necessarily intended to serve a purpose. Such objects are purposive without purpose, so to speak. The beauty of a natural landscape matches and exceeds the beauty of a painting of the same, but both are conceived as intended, as it were. Now, in accounting for these criteria of judgment, Kant is actually of the same mind as Hume. The properties thus judged are not out there, but they're within the cognitive, sentimental, affective states of the judge. And this leaves Kant with a question of just how such judgments are made, since they are neither elementary sensations nor compounds of these, but are decisively cognitive, even epistemic from the point of view of the beholder. Kant's answer to the question, how do we judge X to be beautiful, is developed in the form of what he calls the 4 moments of aesthetic judgment. I must be terribly brief in summarizing these. First, as the aesthetic judgment is disinterested, the object need not result in any agreeable feelings or estimations of moral goodness. This is the difference between aesthetic and moral judgment. And to this extent, Kant liberates aesthetics from ethical assessments, from political correctness, from hedonistic calculations. The object is not beautiful because it pleases because it is beautiful. Emphasis, then, is on the formal structure of the object rather than such sensuous properties as color and tone. Now, the second moment is that of universality. If Hume is right, there really would be nothing to dispute in judgments of beauty. But there are disputes, often tied to very close analysis of formal properties. So to make an aesthetic judgment is not to report a preference, but to declare a truth of sorts, which is entirely different from having a sensation. Now, the third movement is that of seeming purposivity in the object. The pleasure aroused by aesthetically worthy objects is not unlike the pleasure of the job well done. That is, there's a sense of finality, completion, achievement. P.S. Modern architecture need not apply. Now again, the irrelevant question is whether this is all really in the object of experience. Kant is laying out the grounds of judgment itself, not the ontological terrain on which we might find real properties. But perhaps the heaviest burden of his theory must be borne by what is attributed to the fourth moment, wherein the aesthetic judgment carries with it the concept of necessity. For anything to be necessarily what it is requires that it comes about as a result of a non-contingent principle. Now, rather oddly, Kant at this point invokes an intuitionist notion similar to Thomas Reid's conception of a principle of common sense. His treatment of the matter here is laborious, but matches up to some extent with the role of the pure categories of the understanding in his first critique, which would establish the forms of knowledge, and indeed the pure intuitions of time and space, which establish the forms of experience. Aesthetic judgments on this account are drawn from a framework, a categorical scheme of possible judgments, a scheme that grounds all judgment, and that is neither empirical nor logical, but foundational. As a final comment on Kant's aesthetic theory, let me insert his pithy definition of genius. Quote, "Genius is the natural endowment that gives the rule to art. Since talent is an innate productive ability of the artist, and as such belongs itself to nature, we could also put it this way. Genius is the innate mental predisposition through which nature gives the rule to art." Close quote. Now, no friend to the romanticism of Sturm und Drang, Kant nevertheless presents artistic genius as instantiated in certain beings that nature speaks not so much to as through. Now, the combined influence of Hume and Kant, that odd couple in which each is best understood through the challenges posed by the other, that pairing has shaped the philosophy of aesthetics in such a way as to divorce it from the moral, religious, and political worlds in which art originally found its place. On the Humean account, aesthetics is that part of empirical psychology that identifies the features of the external world, generally productive of agreeable feelings. How this works is really a matter of scientific research. All attempts to answer the question by examining the actual objects would be futile. On the Kantian account, the very disinterested nature of aesthetic judgment divorces it directly from such non-aesthetic judgments as are made in moral and political philosophy, art for the sake of art, as it were. Now, early in the 20th century, G.E. Moore, in his Principia Ethica, published in 1903, offered a rather different and radical conception of beauty. He posits two worlds, one of exquisite and uninterrupted beauty, and one of rank and unrelieved ugliness. He then asks if the former is not preferable, even if no one were left to experience it. He argues that such a world is preferable, and that this very preference defeats the claim that the concept of beauty is exhausted by the resources of experience and feeling, or even those of human judgment. He concludes that on this basis, quote, "We shall have to include in our ultimate end something beyond the limits of human existence. I admit, of course, that our beautiful world would be better still if there were human beings in it to contemplate and enjoy its beauty. But that admission makes nothing against my points. If it be once admitted that the beautiful world in itself is better than the ugly, then it follows that however many beings may enjoy it, and however much better their enjoyment may be than it is itself, yet its mere existence adds something to the goodness of the whole. It is not only a means to our end, but also itself a part thereof." Well, G.E. Moore is giving us the possibility of beauty without a percipient to perceive it. Something wonderfully Pythagorean about that. The Pythagorean theorem is true. It's the true form of the right-angled triangle and would remain so whether there ever were actual triangles or actual beings who learned the Pythagorean theorem. And with G.E. Moore, we get an aesthetic theory according to which the formal properties realized in objects of art and constitutive of beauty would be constitutive of beauty, whether we were there to see and hear this or not. Our task, then, is to find beauty, and not merely attempt to mint it in the busy and cluttered world of our own preferences and penchants. Interesting to think about that. I wonder if today's artists are thinking about that.